Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à cette deuxième journée du colloque international sur les économies de la promesse qui est organisé par le Centre interuniversitaire de la recherche sur la science et la technologie, mieux connu sous le nom du CIRST. Mon nom est Guillaume et c'est moi qui agirai aujourd'hui à titre de président pour la conférence d'ouverture de cette deuxième journée du colloque. Nous sommes très heureux d'accueillir ce matin Dr. Paul Martin. I'll introduce you, Dr. Martin, in a second, as I said. But first, I have some information to share in both French and English about the etiquette of this virtual meeting. Donc, voici quelques indications d'ordre général sur le format et le fonctionnement de cette séance qui s'appliqueront aussi aux autres séances de la journée. Donc, cette séance sera ou est enregistrée, y compris les commentaires publics qui sont faits à tous dans le module du chat. Les caméras sont désactivées par défaut, mais vous pouvez les activer en tout temps. Durant la séance, Hélène va vous transmettre des informations par le biais du chat. Excusez-moi. Sentez-vous bien à l'aise d'utiliser la messagerie à votre tour pour échanger avec les autres participants ou pour partager des informations en lien avec la présentation. Et vous êtes aussi invité à rédiger vos questions et à les envoyer via le chat à la personne présidente, qui est moi, en fait, pour une courte période de questions-réponses qui suivra la conférence. Si votre question n'est pas sélectionnée, nous vous encourageons à réserver pour les salons à garder vos questions, en fait, pour les salons de pause ou les discussions de fin de journée. Je vous invite à consulter l'horaire pour l'horaire, justement, et les liens Zoom. This session is recorded, included the comments shared to everyone in the chat. Your video feed is deactivated by default. You can turn them on whenever you feel like. And during the session, Ellen will send you information via the chat. Feel free to use the chat to exchange with other attendees or to share related or relevant information. And throughout Dr. Martin's presentation, we invite you to send your questions to me via the chat for the Q&A session. If your question is not selected, we invite you to keep it with you for the networking session or the break, which takes place later at the end of the day. Please consult the program for more details. Comme je le disais tout à l'heure, nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir Paul Martin, qui est professeur au département de sociologie de l'Université de Sheffield. Professeur Martin a eu une formation en biologie moléculaire et ses travaux se situent à l'intersection des études en STS et celles de la sociologie de la médecine. Paul Martin est aussi co-directeur du Centre de recherche multidisciplinaire, l'Institut pour l'étude de l'humain, ou ROYAUME-UNI, un centre de recherche qui a pour mandat d'explorer ce qui signifie être humain au 21e siècle. Professeur Martin travaille présentement sur un projet majeur portant sur les médicaments orphelins pour les maladies rares à prix élevé, un projet de recherche financé par le Wellcome Trust. Parmi ses autres intérêts de recherche, on y trouve le développement clinique et commercial de la génomique et l'édition du génome, les nouvelles méthodes et concepts biosociaux en sciences sociales et le rôle de la science dans les politiques sociales. Donc, Paul Martin is a Sociology of Science and Technology professor at the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. Dr. Martin has been trained in molecular biology, and his work is located at the intersection of STS and medical sociology. He's also co-director of the Multidisciplinary Research Center, the Institute for the Study of the Human, ROYAUME-UNI, which seeks to explore what it means to be human in the 21st century. One of his current projects is on high-priced orphan drugs for rare disease, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust. And other research interests include the clinical and commercial development of genomics and genome editing, novel biosocial concepts and methods in the social sciences, and the role of science in social policy. Je cède maintenant la parole au professeur Paul Martin. It is with great pleasure that I will now give the floor to Professor Paul Martin for his lecture entitled Making the Bioeconomy Possible, Promissory Infrastructures, the Entrepreneurial State, and the Scale-Up of Whole Genome Sequencing in the UK. Professor Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to talk today. So I'm going to share my screen. So can you see this?
No.
Okay, hang on then.
The share screen button is at the bottom of the Zoom application.
Sorry about this.
It's okay.
To leave my screen now. There we go. It's always the way with these things. Now, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll put it onto full screen mode. Okay.
I'll mute.
Okay. So that's not in full screen, is it?
I think if you press F5, oh, there you go.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so and I think I've got about 40 minutes or 35 minutes, something like that. Is that right? So, and then some questions. So I'll proceed on that basis. So, so this is a piece of work, or presenting a piece of work that's still very much ongoing. It represents a long-running interest I have in two things. One is the sort of promissory bioeconomy, which speaks to the theme of the conference you're organizing, but also the development of genomics more generally internationally. So, and I hope the talk will sort of interweave those two strands to use a case study of the development of genomics in the UK to illustrate what I think are some really important points or interesting points about promissory economies, economies of promise. So the two questions that are going to shape and guide this talk are going to be, how did genomic data become seen as a valuable economic asset by the UK government? And how has this shaped UK government investment? So those two seem very normative, but I think they raise a lot of questions about, as I say, the economies of promise, which I hope will become clear as I go on. So the aim and structure of the talk is going to be just sketching out very briefly a conceptual framework that touches on platform capitalism, promissory organizations, and the entrepreneurial state. And I'm using these ideas heuristically to try and frame the analysis. This is very much work in progress. It's not fully conceptually developed. So I'd really welcome feedback on that. I'm going to sketch the vision of genomic medicine in UK policy that's guided this massive investment over the last sort of 20 years. And in particular, it's constructed the National Health Service, so this is the sort of state service that dominates UK healthcare, as a source of value, as a source of economic value. And then that's guided a series of strategic investments in genomics over a long period of time. And I'm very interested in a recent move over the last few years where the discourse around this investment has moved from talk about infrastructures to talk about platforms, in particular digital platforms, and the creation of particular digital assets. I think I'll just start by saying my view is that genomics has yet to be proved to be of significant economic worth or of clinical benefit. That is still very much in the making, very disputed. And so my argument is that many of these infrastructures and developments that are being put in place are highly promissory in nature. And so it is striking that something like £2 billion has been invested over this period of time in building these infrastructures on the basis of promises. So I'm just going to jump straight in to talk about platform capitalism. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. I'll read out this quote in length or whatever. So I've got quite a lot of long slides. I'm not going to go into them all. They're there really for background. But I think the key point I want to make conceptually about platform capitalism, so we're talking about companies such as Google or Facebook, is that a key part of what they do is mobilize these codes and data analytics to compose imminent infrastructures, and that according to Langley and Lation, they're prioritizing rapid upscaling and extracting revenues from circulations and associated data trails. It's a model based on venture capitalism. So just to sort of summarize that in a bit more clarity, that these platform companies that we're very used to thinking about extract rents, extract economic value, monetize basically the immaterial assets they have, these data sets and linkages, the search streams we do in Google, the interactions we have in Facebook. And the argument that some of the theorists in this area make is that the industrial model of the business model behind these platform enterprises is one that, as I say, is structured along the lines that venture capital is very used to. So there's two aspects that are important here. One is a rapid scaling up, and the second is this portfolio approach, whereby they capitalize different firms with different models. There's a period of experimentation, and a relatively small number of companies survive to sell viable assets. So I'm going to argue that this is relevant in terms of thinking about what's going on in the UK genomics sector. So that's just, I'm not going to develop that in any great depth now, but I want to just hold that thought in terms of how we might think about what's going on. The second idea is, well, related to this is assetization. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the work of Keen Birch. And he's very interested in how assets are created and how rents are extracted from these assets, particularly in the context of the knowledge economy and science and technology. And so the question here is how assets and the economic rents they engender are made in each particular case. So I'm trying to, in the case of UK genomics, use this analysis to try and think about how a set of assets have been created, and the language of assets is used explicitly in most recent years in the NHS to think about extracting value and making a business out of genomics in the UK. The second sort of point is about imaginaries, and these emerging platform companies, I would argue, are guided by these imaginaries of future applications and users. So these very much promissory assets. So I've written about this in the past, this idea of assets in the making. These are things such as potential scientific discoveries and new knowledge production, which are hard to exchange or value. So in a very early stage company, for example, a platform company or a biotechnology company, they create new knowledge, they create new potential products, but these are not valued in any straightforward way. They're promissory in nature. Many of these companies no longer trade, but they go bust on the basis of the fact that these assets have not been realized in practice. So the value of businesses and assets of this sort are validated by users and by market transactions. So once they start selling these assets or renting out these assets, then they can survive and these assets take on a real value rather than a promissory value. I mentioned in the introduction this idea of promissory organization. So I'm using a number of sort of concepts in the literature here. This is work done by Pollock and Williams. And they're very interested, when they wrote this paper some time ago, about intermediaries that specialized in the production, commodification, and selling of future-oriented knowledge. So they particularly use the examples of consultancies who set up these expectation dynamics around the potential value of these expectations for different organizations. So they're very much specialized. These intermediaries are very much specializing in the mobilization and organization of expectations. I've thought a little bit about the way in which venture capitalists act as a form of promissory organization and the key role they have in mobilizing futures. So again, to pick up on this idea of that being part of the sort of concept behind some aspects of platform capitalism, this sort of model of mobilizing expectations and promises through things like storytelling, visioning are really important. And then finally, the third concept I'm just going to not go into any detail here. This is the entrepreneurial state. So this is very much work developed by Mazzucato. So a state which is the primary risk taker in innovation-based investments. And there's been a lot of interest in this concept of the entrepreneurial state in the last 20 years as discourses around the knowledge economy have become very present and important and influential in policymaking in science and technology. And I think what's really interesting in that, I'm not going to read this quote, but is stressing the way in which the state is playing this risk-taking role, substituting for the private sector. So she's saying, daring to think against all odds about the impossible creation of new technologies and the way in which it coordinates a network of actors. So I want to argue that these concepts are useful in trying to understand the story I'm going to tell now. So I'm going to go into some detail to talk through what I think is actually a remarkable set of transformations in the context of the British National Health Service and the investment in genomics. Before doing that, the key issue and thing I want to highlight is this very powerful imaginary, socio-technical imaginary, that's been created over 20 years in the wake of the Human Genome Project. And I think this is shared in Canada and the United States and many, many countries. And it's this idea of using genomic data. So this is the gene sequence data from our bodies, from individuals and populations, to improve the diagnosis of disease and targeting therapies. So this is it's been called various things: personalized medicine, stratified medicines, different sort of handles this is given. But that central imaginary of using gene sequencing to improve diagnosis and therapy is absolutely central to what I'm going to be talking about, and has guided all these discourses and investments. I think it has a very powerful performative role in shaping health futures, about how we think about the types of healthcare, the types of medicine that might be developed in the future. So what's really striking, I'm something of a student of policy in this area over a long period of time, is that there's been a series of, I don't know, certainly more than 30 reports promoting genomics in the UK over the last 15 years. I probably don't have all of them either. I'm not going to list them, but it started out with a proposal for a piece of legislation in 2003, the Genetics White Paper, and there's been a whole series of iterations through different governments, when there was New Labour, when there was a Conservative alliance with the Liberals, and when there's a Conservative government now. It survived all these changes in the overall policy framework. And I think the key thing I want to highlight here is that whilst the overall imaginary of genomic medicine has remained the same, the specific visions and details in the different policy documents have changed substantially. So if you go back to look at the documents in 2003, they read in a very different light, with a very different set of expectations and promises compared to, say, the most recent report in 2020. I think that's very important, because there's this period of sort of experimentation, of discursive change, of reframing these discourses. So a few years ago, it was all about how genomics would help with the post-Brexit economy. And now it's very much about the post-pandemic economy. So it's, again, not going to read this out, but the first sort of attempt to construct what I see as the most important shift here was in 1999. And this is the idea of rethinking the National Health Service. This is a fully state-funded healthcare service, not just as a sort of drain on the national tax economy, but in the light of the knowledge economy as something that is a potential site of economic productivity and competitiveness. So Robin Fears and George Post, who are both working for the pharmaceutical company SmithKline Beecham, wrote this influential piece in Science in which they talked about the untapped value of the NHS and the need to capitalize on it, and doing this by building a very large data infrastructure and using public-private partnerships. And that framework of thinking of the NHS as a site of value production through partnerships with the private sector based on data infrastructures has remained absolutely central to all policy thinking in this area over the last 20 years. So I'd argue this new paradigm started to arise in the mid to late 2000s, where UK policy was guided by these series of expectations and principles that genomics and biotechnology holds great promise for health and wealth. And this combination, this aligning of both health and wealth in the same phrase becomes part of the visioning going on here, that the National Health Service is a source of economic value and needs to be transformed in terms of enabling this. So lots of talk later on about disruptive change, about transformation in order to enable this to happen. And the role of the state in supporting innovation and promoting public-private collaboration and knowledge transfer through the building of these infrastructures. So as I say, there's this report in 2003, which is called Big T. That's a biotechnology innovation growth team. And that was the first time this was explicitly made a piece of public policy. I think the title of the report was something like Improving Health and Creating Wealth. So these two ideas coming together. And it was also pitching the NHS as a site of a source of competitive advantage in the biotechnology sector. And this again has run through all the policy documents since then, that exploiting the National Health Service in this way gives the UK an economic and competitive advantage. And that it starts talking about this as a major asset for clinical trials and for innovation. So it goes back quite a long way. Now, what I want to talk about is, in a little bit more detail, is how this started to be translated in practice a little bit later on. And most significantly, is setting up of something called Genomics England Limited. And the limited is, it indicates in British law, it's a limited company, it's a business. So this was established in 2012 to run something called the 100,000 Genomes Project. So this was fully sequencing 100,000 British patients, all the base pairs in their DNA, to try and pursue this project of personalized medicine. At the time, it was definitely the biggest project of its sort in the world. I think it still probably is. It was something like 300 million pounds, that's about $500 million US dollars, was committed to the initial startup funding, and it was focusing on cancer and rare genetic disorders. I'm not going to go into the details. I don't think that's material here. I think what's interesting is the governance and the form that this takes and the promises made around it. So this is a typical statement that would be made in relationship that the genome profile will be doctors a new advanced understanding of the patient's genetic makeup, condition and treatment, and ensure they have access to the right drugs and personalized care. So this imaginary of personalized medicine, absolutely central to the foundation of this. Now, what's interesting about Genomics in England is both its claim benefits and its structure. The claim benefits that we're trying to mainstream whole genome sequencing in the NHS. So this idea of putting genomics at the absolute heart of UK healthcare starts to become a really important discourse. And delivering the benefits to the community at large, both in terms of health and future wealth. So again, this aligning of health and wealth creation in the context of building an infrastructure for genomic medicine. Now, what's I think most striking about Genomics England is its organization. So it's set up as a for-profit company, 100% owned by the Department of Health, with a commercial board. So this is essentially a business run in the context of the Department of Health, and it remains so. It's been managing hundreds of millions of pounds worth of public money. And in terms of its initial aims and objectives, it's going to have very much a decentralized contracting out type of model. It's going to be flexible, agile, and move quickly to the market changes, participate in the market as a business, talking to businesses, and secure the benefits of investment flows from the community to a large range of companies and contractors. In other words, its central mission was very much concerned with business, about business development, about creating markets, about creating a UK genomics industry. So as well as being a sort of research and development project, sequencing these 100,000 people and their genomes, it was governed very much along commercial lines. And this is part of a broader strategy, which was set up in 2017. There's a UK life sciences industrial strategy. So as I mentioned before, much of the discourse around the creation of these infrastructures is about UK economic competitiveness. And so this life sciences industrial strategy was part of that. 2017 was the year after Brexit. It was very much framed by the hopes of improving economic competitiveness. I won't go into this in any great detail, but a new health advanced research program was established, a sort of targeted model based on DARPA in the United States that was promoting industry collaboration with the NHS, and in which it would try and give those UK companies competitive edge, but also in which the NHS might end up owning equity stakes in these companies. So this is taking public-private partnerships a bit further in terms of the sort of capitalization of NHS assets. And in the review of this, the life sciences industrial strategy was set a vision, and this word vision crops up time and time and time again. So again, promissory language in terms of these economies of promise to deliver future growth in the sector, and highlighting that the UK is going to build on its strength in order to remain globally competitive. So this idea of being world leading and globally competitive is absolutely essential to all these recent policy documents. And following on from this, there was a commitment to build a new health service, a genomic medical service within the NHS. So this is a dedicated service to mainstream genomic medicine into the bulk of health services in the UK. And it was very much about providing quicker diagnosis, treatment of cancer, but also involved, I think, very significantly, the restructuring of a whole series of genetic services, which in practice meant breaking the professional monopoly of clinical geneticists in this area. So very much about disruption. And sequencing up to 5 million NHS patients. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. So a grand scale, this is astonishing. No other country is attempting, as I understand it in the globe, anything like this. This is potentially a whole genome costs about £1,000 a go, so that is potentially a commitment in the long run as something between 3 and 5 billion pounds, $5 billion US dollars. So you're talking about a massive investment, a transformational program to extract value from the NHS. Now, I'm just going to stop just for a second in terms of telling this tale, just to sort of reflect. There was a House of Commons, so this is the UK Parliament, their Science and Technology Committee had an inquiry into this area in 2017, 2018. Evidence was given from a range of stakeholders. Everybody was talking about being very excited, and there was also promissory talk about this. There were claimed benefits for whole genome sequencing, for pharmacogenetics, and for cost effectiveness. All of these were disputed by expert evidence. And it's very striking that in the final report of this committee, they came to this conclusion that there's great potential for whole genome sequencing, but there is not yet sufficient unambiguous evidence gathered to demonstrate its benefit for routine care, in particular for common cancers, which was the main area of investment. And they noted that such evaluation does not appear to have been conducted, or at least not been made public. They criticised Genomics England for never having established some way of evaluating the cost effectiveness of this investment in terms of patient care. And I would argue very strongly that that's still the case today. So despite these massive amounts of investment being made into this area, there is no proven evidence as yet that on a significant scale, there are anecdotes of improvements in care and lots of sort of technical arguments about the benefits of this, but in the main, there is no systematic evidence of how this has improved patient care in the UK to date. And I think that's really important in terms of this idea of economies of promise. This is still very much a promissory enterprise that has yet to prove its worth in the clinic. So I'm just going to update now what's happened recently before sort of drawing to a bit of a conclusion in some of these things. What's striking is the continued ambition to accelerate and scale up at great speed data collection, genomic data collection and integration. We know anecdotally from talking to people involved in some of these programs that they're put under enormous pressure institutionally by their managers and by external bodies to get on board with these programs and to not resist or complain. So it's very much sort of these changes, these programs are being forced through at speed and at scale at a local level. So in 2020, so last year, there was another program announced called the Accelerating Detection of Disease. It was very much about recruiting this 5 million patients that were talked about when the Genomic Medicine Service was set up. And it's about the early diagnosis of common diseases. And again, as with most of these programs, genomic data, so this gene sequencing information, will be linked directly to personalized medical records. And the language that's used in here is very much that of platforms. So these people say they're building a platform, the people managing and delivering this program. And what's really striking about the funding for this is it's match funding with industry, and it has an industrial governance structure with industry very heavily involved in program design. It's still at an early stage, I have to say, so we'll see. But what it will give is third-party access to data, these integrated data sets that combine genomic data and personal medical data, health records, and that, we're still yet to see on what basis that access will be granted, but that's the commitment. So this is a way of generating these integrated data sets on a huge scale, 5 million people. The latest report in 2020, Promoting Genomics, is very much about vision. As I mentioned before, that there's issues here about with what evidence there is to support some of these things. I'm not saying there's no evidence, but there's not as much evidence as you would expect to see to support some of these investments. So the visions are still very important. The word vision is used 15 times in this document, the latest strategy, which is far more than some other important terms you might search for. It has few specific examples of success stories or evidence of evaluation. And there are 4 detailed visions in relationship to stakeholder engagement, workforce development, coordinating data analytics, and industrial growth. So it's becoming much more specific in terms of what types of programmatic visions are being pursued. And it talks about, I think what's really striking in the context of, I'd say, the way I've set this talk up is it's talking about now assets in a way that is completely new to my reading of UK policy documents. This is very rarely used prior to the last few years. So it's talking about assets such as biobank. This is a big research project, the ADD, Accelerating Detection of Disease, Genomics England data sets. Again, the promissory language, the UK becoming a leading global hub, the very center of our economic recovery after COVID-19. So it's combining these different tropes, the value of genomics for economic growth and delivering healthcare and in economic competitiveness. So just sort of as I get towards the end of this sort of story, what's really interesting is now how other parts of the NHS are starting to get very involved in data integration. And this is the combination of this, I say, personal medical records, electronic medical records with this genomic data. So there's been a massive data infrastructure built in the National Health Service over the last 20 years, huge amount of effort. I mean, it's been highly controversial, as in many other healthcare systems. It's not gone smoothly, a lot of waste, but they're finally getting there. And what was interesting is the setting up a few years ago of NHS X, it's called, Nhs Digital. And this is delivering digital transformation of health and social care. So this is very much about bringing in those insights from digital platforms, digital economies, and using that as a way of delivering new forms of healthcare. And specifically, this development, I think, is really interesting. In November 2021, a new resource was set up to support data-driven innovation. It's called the Centre for Improving Data Collaboration. And its mission was to promote data sharing with industry through deals with firms based on access to patient data and intellectual property. And it was also about promoting the co-creation of innovative technologies using data. And part of its mission statement talks about, essentially uses the language of what I would call business development. So this is realizing the value of health data assets. So this is a quote. They're using the language of assets and platforms now in terms of thinking about what they're going to do. And their role is determining how value from health data assets should be derived across both financial and in-kind value return. So this is the advice they're going to give to NHS hospitals and service providers and those people generating and holding data assets at a local and regional level in the health service. It's about enhancing the value return from health data assets through innovative approaches to data collection and understanding how value can be realized and distributed across the healthcare system. So as I say, I see this as language very much as business development, using a platform capitalism type of language taken from digital economies, where assets are at the heart of what is being discussed. Interestingly, around the same time, there's a new business model for Genomics England. So this is this company was set up in 2012 to deliver the 100,000 genome project. It's now been tasked with delivering this much wider rollout of whole genome sequencing across the National Health Service. And it's moving from being a project manager to being a national platform for clinical diagnosis and research. And it's interesting, this quote from Chris Wrigley is the CEO. He has a background, he was at McKinsey, so the consultancy organization where he ran their AI and machine learning part of their business, basically. So this is, again, coming from the digital economy, looking at ways in which that knowledge and those models can be applied to generating value from these assets. So, and he's now saying, as a platform organization, we'll enable an ecosystem for genomics in the UK. And their business model, having talked to some of the people involved in this, is very much about this realization of the value of these digital assets derived from gene sequencing combined with medical information. And just finally, the last bit of detail before drawing things together, just to mention this, but this shows you the scale of ambition in this area. Earlier this year, there was a proposal to establish a new centralized database of the general practitioner records. So this is the community-based healthcare deliveries part of the UK, so the general practitioners, of 61 million patients. So basically everybody in the UK. And this was going to be done on the basis of so-called presumed consent. In other words, you could opt out, but it was assumed that you would opt in. And then this will be linked to other data sets, such as the gene sequencing databases, and shared with researchers and companies. So it's explicitly going to be made available to business and industry and commercialized in that way. I think the assumption is that this will be another one of these digital assets that will be monetized. It was similar to a previous proposal in 2014, something called Care Data, that ran into a tremendous amount of political opposition from the profession and public. And I have to say, just last week, I think it was announced that this latest proposal has been shelved or at least postponed. So this might reach the limit of what is acceptable politically. I have to say that this was handled incompetently, and had it been handled a bit better, then it may still be going ahead. But it speaks to the ambition of building these infrastructures and collecting these data assets. Okay, so just to try and draw this to a close, I want to argue that the UK state might be seen as a promissory organisation in terms of these new promissory economies. There's this sustained imaginary over 20 years of the role of genomics in the bioeconomy and the NHS as a source of future value. And I say that the role this might play in UK economic competitiveness. It's had a powerful performative role in shaping policy and guiding what I estimate to be between £1 and £2 billion worth of investment. It's building a series of promissory infrastructures and assets that yet to deliver significant patient benefit. They may in the future, I'm not saying that they won't do that, but at the moment, this is all built on promises, on expectations. But NHSX, I think, is really striking as it's now carrying out a business development function by providing support for market creation, asset validation. So it's going way beyond what a traditional tech transfer office would do, I would argue. And there are many other policies promoting disruptive change, technology adoption and innovation in the NHS, National Health Service more generally. So this is part of a sort of genre of critique. The NHS needs to be opened up, it needs to be marketized, it needs to have an innovation culture, it needs to be disrupted. So again, the language and tropes of the digital economy. So, are we seeing changes in the entrepreneurial state? So, we take Mazzucato's sort of premise that many of the technologies that have been central to recent techno-science derived from, in particular, US state investment in these emerging areas. It was state support that was central. So I would argue seeing a shift from underwriting and de-risking the development of these technologies, which had traditionally been done through research investment, through the building of infrastructures and knowledge exchange, to the state, in this case, in the UK, around genomics, acting as a platform enterprise. It involves visioning, scale up and disruption, institutional experimentation, the creation of promissory assets, and having a business development function and commercial governance. I can't stress too strongly how involved business people are in governing most of these programs, sitting on the boards, designing the programs, etc. So just to conclude, there's been a key role for genomics in the imaginary of future bioeconomy. So genomics has been center stage, absolutely center stage, to this idea that one of the new knowledge-based industries in the UK is going to be important in economic competitiveness, and genomics will be central to that. The UK state has built massive genomics infrastructures based on this imaginary over this period of time, and it's been accelerating that investment and the building of these platforms in recent times. I think there's been a more recent shift from infrastructures to platforms and the creation of these assets, these promissory assets. And this language of assetification and platforms is now starting to pervade policy documents, as I say, in a way that I've never seen before. So that language of these promissory economies has been very important to that. There's a lack of evidence of significant clinical or economic benefit. There's been a lot of benefit for those companies who are subcontractors and who are holding the contracts for delivering these gene sequencing, in particular the company Illumina. I could say a lot more about that. Have contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds. But the actual benefits in the medium term, certainly to patients and the bioeconomy in the UK, it may happen, but it's yet to be proven. But I want to argue that perhaps this reflects broader changes in the governance of the entrepreneurial state. It may be particular to the UK, it may be particular to this area, but I think it's highly significant. So that's the story. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Thanks so much, Dr. Martin, for the fascinating talk. I've had like a question. I have a question of my own as well. A question was sent to me, but I wanted to open the floor to the attendees in case to give the floor to the attendees if one of you have a question, si l'un d'entre vous a une question pour Dr. Martin. vois juste quelques-uns d'entre vous. Je vais poser la question qui m'a été envoyée. At the beginning of your presentation, you talk about state expectations in the development of genomics, and also about the predominant role of venture capitalists in the making of that infrastructure. So what would be the role of venture capitalists in the development of the hype around genomics in the UK? And do they play a role in the implementation of that infrastructure?
So I think in terms of venture capital in the UK, I think its role is a bit different from it would be in, say, the classic cases of Silicon Valley in the US. So I'd argue that in the context of the US, where companies like Illumina are based, these big genomics companies, I think they're very important in terms of creating expectations, particularly for early stage companies, not messy for the mature industry, because obviously they're very much involved in the early life cycle of startups. So I think they're very responsible, very involved in this sort of multiplicity of hope around certain technologies such as genomics. So if you go back to the early stages of the genomics industry, they would have been very centrally involved in the founding of these companies and the hopes around them. I think in terms of ongoing expectations, there are a set of other companies that start to come in the UK, and these tend to be, if you like, data analytics and bioinformatic companies. So they're not necessarily venture investors, but there may be other types of investor that are interested. I think one of my observations and criticisms of what's going on here is that until very recently, a lot of this investment, which is supposed to be in the name of commerce, there was very little use by it by pharmaceutical companies. So although it was built in the name of improving pharmaceutical innovation, those big pharma companies had very little to do with it in terms of using the data. That's starting to change. So this is very much driven by, I'd say, elite policymakers who have close connections with industry, but tend to be these sort of scientific entrepreneurs.
Thanks. We have a question by Dr. Conrad. You make a clear distinction between infrastructures and platforms in your discussion. And so the question is, aren't platforms not forms of infrastructure as well?
Yes, I mean, of course. But I think what's really interesting is that the language of platforms is the language of the digital economy. And in the literature, in the digital society sort of literature, there is a distinction made between infrastructures and platforms, as I understand it, are basically a means of creating assets, these digital assets that can be monetized. So that is perhaps not so much a technical distinction in terms of what's being built, but it's a business and organizational distinction about creating assets that can be monetized by them having a sort of monopoly on that. So what's really interesting about Genomics England is that their business model is creating a platform that is partly the technology they're going to license out to other countries or other institutions, and partly getting at that because the UK investment is so big and because they're going to be a first mover advantage, then the hope is that these digital assets they create from all this genomic data and integrated with personal medical data will give them an edge in terms of selling this to industry.
Perhaps just as a quick follow-up, like I'm trained in anthropology, and so when we think about infrastructure in anthropology, we think about the non-human, of course, but also the human that constructed these infrastructures as well. And this is not a part that you've touched on it towards the end of the talk, but not as much. So I was wondering if there's a consideration about these patients as well and how they make these infrastructures possible also, or these platforms possible, or their participation into this infrastructure.
Sorry, the participation of patients.
Yeah. Oh, like to share their information about their body.
I think this is very, very interesting. So I didn't talk about, there's so much going on in this space, it's just unbelievable. But the first big project in this area was something called UK Biobank, which is again one of the biggest projects in its kind. It's the gene environment interaction study. But the key thing is it recruited successfully 500,000 people over the age of 45, I think it was. It took them about 5 years. the recruitment rate was something less than 10%. In other words, that people were not convinced or not easily convinced the benefit of signing up to this. And so I think one of the reasons that they're talking about with certainly the GP data integration of not requiring consent about having an opt-out is because I think building these infrastructures at scale is very difficult in terms of participation. And because the benefits are not clear, you know, as I say, this is very promissory, so it's hard to get people engaged. And what was interesting was the resistance to this new program recently. Over 1 million people had already opted out in the first couple of months. So they are getting there in terms of building these infrastructures, but the patient engagement with them is very mixed. In the rare disease area, where they can see distinct benefits for genome sequencing, then the recruitment has been okay. But in other areas, it's been extremely difficult. So these things still might fail, if you like, in terms of their scope of their ambition, because they cannot get people engaged and participating.
Thanks so much. The time allotted for this session is running out. So I invite you all to join us in the virtual break room. The link is available in the program. Et puis je vais répéter en français. Merci, merci beaucoup, Dr. Martin, pour votre présentation, for your presentation. It was very interesting.